He felt the tug first, like his board had snagged on something deep and heavy. Jesse Billauer looked down the line at Zuma Beach and saw only bright water and a clean break, the kind of day that makes you believe nothing bad can reach you out there. Then the ocean hit him from underneath with a violent pull that didn't feel like a wave. It felt like a mouth. Jesse was 17, a Southern California kid who lived for surfing. On February 25, 1996, he paddled out at Zuma, just off Malibu, chasing the same thing he always chased. One more ride, one more moment of control on moving water. He wasn't alone. Other surfers were scattered nearby, waiting for sets, calling out, drifting in the casual rhythm of a weekend morning. The great white shark came up fast. People later described a sudden eruption, a dark shape, a burst of foam. Jesse felt pressure clamp into his lower back and hips, and then a ripping release as the animal shook and let go. He didn't see the shark's full body in that instant. He felt it. The bite tore through muscle and bone, and, most devastatingly, through his spine. When the water calmed, he was still on his board, but something fundamental was gone. He tried to kick, to stabilize, to paddle, and nothing happened. His legs stayed dead weight beneath him. He knew immediately he couldn't feel them. The people around him reacted before he could. A nearby surfer turned and saw blood spreading in the water, and Jesse's face locked in shock. Shouts broke across the surface. Lifeguards raced toward him on rescue boards, and other surfers moved in close, forming a moving barrier as if they could keep the shark from circling back. Jesse clung to his board with his arms, trying to stay upright, trying not to look down, because looking down made it real. The lifeguards reached him and got him onto a rescue board. The hardest part was the distance. Every second out there felt exposed. Jesse's blood trailed behind them in a thin ribbon, and the ocean that had always been his home suddenly felt like a place that wanted him dead. They paddled hard, timing the push of the water so they wouldn't dump him. On shore, more lifeguards ran to meet them, hands out, voices urgent, faces tight with focus. They lifted Jesse onto the sand and started immediate care. The wound to his back was severe. He was losing blood. He was also losing heat, shaking as adrenaline crashed through him. Jesse kept asking what happened, then stopped asking because the answer was everywhere. On the sand, on the hands pressing towels into his back, on the frantic faces leaning over him. Someone stabilized his spine. Someone called for an ambulance. Jesse stared up at the sky and tried to move his toes like it was a test he could pass by willpower alone. Nothing moved. At the hospital, surgeons fought to save his life and stabilize the damage. The shark bite had severed his spinal cord. The diagnosis was brutal and immediate: paralysis from the chest down. Jesse had gone into the water that morning, expecting bruises and sunburn and maybe a dinged board. He came out facing a future in a wheelchair. The first weeks were a blur of surgeries, pain management, and the strange silence of a body that no longer obeyed. Jesse's friends visited, trying to talk like nothing had changed, but everything had. His parents sat at his bedside and learned a new language of medicine: vertebrae, nerves, infection risk, pressure sores, respiratory therapy. Jesse learned the other language: how to be patient with helplessness, how to accept help with the most basic things, how to swallow rage without choking on it. Rehabilitation was not inspirational music and quick milestones. It was repetition. It was learning how to transfer from bed to chair without collapsing. It was learning how to dress a body that couldn't balance. It was learning how to protect skin that couldn't feel injury, and how to recognize danger by sight and routine instead of pain. It was staring at his legs, muscular, tan, familiar, and realizing they belonged to him, but no longer belonged to his will. The mental fight was as relentless as the physical one. Jesse had built his identity around movement and risk and being in control of a board under his feet. Now control meant gripping a wheel rim and planning every curb. He had to grieve the life he'd imagined while still being alive inside it. Some days he pushed forward, some days he didn't. The world kept going, and he had to decide whether he would go with it. There were practical losses that nobody prepares you for at 17. Friends headed to school, jobs, dates, parties, and Jesse was learning schedules built around appointments and accessibility. He learned how quickly strangers could turn him into a symbol instead of a person, either an object of pity or a story people use to scare themselves into being grateful. He learned that optimism, when it's forced, can feel like another kind of violence. Over time, Jesse began to find a different kind of momentum. He stayed close to the ocean because abandoning it felt like surrendering his past. He watched his friends surf and felt the ache of it, but he also felt something else, the need to keep people like him from disappearing. He saw how quickly disability could shrink a life, how invitations stopped, how public spaces became obstacles, how people looked away because they didn't know what to say. He started meeting others with spinal cord injuries and realized how many of them had been athletes, workers, parents, people whose lives had narrowed overnight. He didn't want his story to end at the hospital bed, and he didn't want theirs to end there either. Jesse chose visibility. He pushed into adaptive sports, into the messy work of rebuilding a life around what remained instead of what was lost. He helped create Life Rolls On, a foundation focused on quality of life for people living with paralysis. Part of that mission was the ocean itself. Through adaptive surfing programs, he helped build a way for people in wheelchairs to get back into the water with trained support, modified boards, and a crew that understood the difference between can't and not yet. When Jesse returned to the surf in this new way, it wasn't about pretending the attack never happened. It was about reclaiming a place that had been stolen from him. He let other people steady him, position him, paddle him, and he learned to accept that dependence without losing dignity. He learned that independence can also mean choosing your help and choosing your people. Years later, when people asked him what it felt like, he didn't describe a movie moment. He described pressure, confusion, and the instant he understood his body had changed forever. He described the long middle part, months of rehab, setbacks, infections, and fatigue, and the stubborn decision to keep showing up anyway. The shark attack never became a story with a clean ending. Jesse lived with the daily realities of paralysis, medical complications, accessibility battles, the constant negotiation with a world built for walking bodies. But he also built a life that refused to be defined only by what was taken. He became a survivor in the truest sense, not someone who escaped unscarred, but someone who kept going with the scars. On that morning at Zuma, a great white shark changed everything in a few seconds. Jesse Billauer survived the bite, survived the blood loss, survived the shock, and survived the long, grinding aftermath of learning his body again. The ocean did not give him his old life back, but it did not take his will to live either. Thank you for listening to Horrifying Survival Stories. Subscribe for more stories of those who faced the impossible and lived.